Hi there. Welcome to Dreamy Histories channel. Tonight, we're standing on a windswept Scandinavian cliff, watching torch flames dance against the darkness, while distant screams echo across the fjord. You can almost taste the metallic tang of blood in the air and feel the rough hemp ropes binding your wrists, because you've just been captured by Vikings, and they're discussing something called the blood eagle in hushed, reverent tones. Here's a fun reality check. If this were actually happening, you'd probably be begging for a simple beheading right about now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these bedtime stories travel. All right, let's begin the story. You're dragged into a longhouse where firelight casts writhing shadows on carved wooden pillars. The air is thick with smoke and something else. Anticipation, maybe, or religious fervor. The Vikings around you aren't the Hollywood barbarians you might expect. They're organized, purposeful, almost ritualistic in their movements. One of them, a grizzled warrior with intricate arm rings, begins sharpening a peculiarly curved blade while reciting what sounds like poetry. The blood eagle. Even saying those words makes your spine tingle, doesn't it? This wasn't just an execution. It was supposedly a dedication to Odin himself. The victim would be placed face down, their ribs methodically severed from the spine with an axe, then pulled outward to create wings. The lungs would be extracted and draped over these bone wings like some grotesque butterfly. Salt would be rubbed into the wounds, keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. The sagas claim King Aella of Northumbria suffered this fate in 867 CE, revenge for his killing of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. But here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting, I mean academically disturbing. Modern historians are locked in fierce debate about whether the blood eagle actually existed or was merely skaldic poetry taken too literally. Dr. Roberta Frank argues it's all metaphorical, that medieval writers misunderstood kennings, those poetic Viking metaphors, about eagles feeding on corpses after battle. Meanwhile, archaeologists like Dr. Bjorn Samuelson point to skeletal remains from Dorset, England, showing peculiar rib trauma consistent with the ritual's described method. You shift uncomfortably as the Vikings continue their preparations. The archaeological evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. Those Dorset remains. They could indicate ritual execution, sure, but they could also result from particularly vicious combat or post-mortem mutilation for intimidation. The Orkney excavations revealed bodies with similar trauma patterns, dated to the Viking Age, but without written context. We're essentially looking at ancient crime scenes without witness testimony. The most chilling detail comes from the Orkneyinga saga's description of Halfdan Longleg's execution. It specifies that the victim must not cry out during the ritual to ensure their place in Valhalla. Imagine maintaining Viking stoicism while someone literally rearranges your skeleton. Medical experts have weighed in too, suggesting that the shock and blood loss would likely kill the victim within minutes, making the extended torture descriptions physiologically improbable. Then again, the Vikings were nothing if not innovative in their cruelty. Professor Michael Enright's research into Viking religious practices suggests the blood eagle might have been reserved for royal victims, a way to offer the highest possible sacrifice to Odin. Think about it. You're not just killing an enemy. You're transforming them into a divine offering. Their spread ribs mimicking the wings of Odin's ravens. It's simultaneously honoring and utterly destroying your foe. A paradox that fits perfectly with Norse mythology's complex view of death and glory. The warrior with the curved blade approaches you now, and you notice runic inscriptions along its edge. Fun fact that might not comfort you much. Some scholars believe these ritual blades were passed down through generations, accumulating spiritual power with each use. The Vikings believed in the transferability of luck and power through objects, so a blood eagle blade would have been incredibly valuable and incredibly cursed. As terrifying as this sounds lying safe in your bed, remember that Viking society wasn't just about brutality. They had laws, poetry, and complex social structures. The blood eagle, if it existed, would have been an extreme exception, not the rule. Most Viking executions were simple beheadings or hangings, but those don't make for legendary sagas, do they? The blood eagle endures in our imagination precisely because it straddles that line between possibly true and too horrific to contemplate. Your Viking captors are chanting now, something rhythmic and hypnotic. You're starting to understand why this legend persists. It's not just about the gore, but about the intersection of violence and spirituality, vengeance and worship, whether or not it actually happened. The blood eagle represents something profound about how the Vikings understood death, not as an ending, but as a transformation. The chanting stops abruptly when a commotion erupts outside the longhouse. Through the smoke-hazed air, you watch as the heavy wooden doors burst open and a figure stumbles in. No, that's not quite right. This warrior doesn't stumble. He flows like water, jerks like lightning, moves with an animalistic grace that makes your skin crawl. His eyes are dilated to black pools. Foam flecks his beard, and he's completely naked despite the Nordic chill. Meet your first berserker. And yes, he might actually be high on psychedelic mushrooms. The other Vikings immediately give him space. Even that grizzled warrior with the curved blade from earlier backs away respectfully. You notice they're not afraid exactly. It's more like how you'd act around a barely controlled wildfire. Useful, powerful, but utterly unpredictable. The berserker's chest heaves with each breath, and there's something unsettling about how he doesn't seem to feel the cold. Steam actually rises from his skin like he's running a deadly fever. Berserkers, berserkir in Old Norse, were the Viking Age's answer to special forces. If special forces routinely bit their shields and fought naked while hallucinating. The sagas describe them as Odin's chosen warriors, who could channel the fury of bears or wolves, becoming immune to pain and fear. Sounds like fantasy, right? Except multiple contemporary sources, including Byzantine chronicles and Anglo-Saxon records, independently describe encountering these frenzied Norse warriors who fought with superhuman strength and apparent invulnerability. Here's where modern science gets interesting. Ethnobotanist Dr. K. Karsten Fatur has extensively studied the theory that berserkers consumed Amanita muscaria, those red and white spotted mushrooms that look like they're straight from a fairy tale. These fungi contain muscimol and ibotenic acid, psychoactive compounds that can induce aggressive behavior, increase strength perception, deaden pain responses, and cause overheating. Sound familiar? The mushrooms grow abundantly in Scandinavian birch forests, and archaeological evidence shows Vikings had extensive knowledge of local flora. You watch the berserker pace the longhouse like a caged predator, occasionally gnawing on his shield's rim. The leather-wrapped wood shows deep teeth marks, some fresh, others scarred over from previous episodes. Other Vikings toss him chunks of raw meat, which he catches and devours without breaking stride. It's simultaneously ridiculous and terrifying. Imagine trying to fight someone who thinks they're an actual bear and has chemically suppressed their self-preservation instincts. But wait, it gets weirder. Samuel Lorenzo Knapp, a military historian studying Viking battle tactics, notes that berserker units often fought in groups of 12, called Ulfhedna when they channeled wolves instead of bears. These wolf coats would psyche themselves up before battle through ritual dancing, chanting, and yes, possibly mushroom consumption. Roman writers describe similar practices among Germanic tribes centuries earlier, suggesting this wasn't just a Viking thing, but an ancient Nordic tradition of chemically enhanced warfare. The biochemistry is fascinating if you're into that sort of thing. Mushimol affects GABA receptors in your brain, the same system that alcohol hits, but with wildly different results. Instead of getting sleepy and uncoordinated, users report feeling incredibly strong, experiencing time dilation, and losing social inhibitions. The overheating makes sense too. Your body's working overtime while your brain's thermostat is offline. Medieval accounts of berserkers fighting naked in snow suddenly seem less like mythology and more like a practical response to drug-induced hypothermia. Contemporary Christian chroniclers were particularly horrified by berserkers, describing them as devil's servants who could blunt enemy weapons with their gaze. Historians still argue whether this reputation for invulnerability came from actual mushroom-induced pain tolerance or just really effective psychological warfare. Imagine being a 9th century English farmer turned soldier, and suddenly there's a naked, screaming Viking charging at you, seemingly unbothered by the spear you just stuck through his shoulder. You'd probably start believing in weapon-blunting magic too. The berserker in the longhouse has calmed slightly, now sitting cross-legged by the fire and staring into the flames with unblinking intensity. Another Viking carefully approaches and starts applying some kind of salve to numerous wounds across the berserker's body, cuts and gashes he apparently didn't notice acquiring. This post-Fury medical care was actually a crucial part of berserker culture. The sagas mention berserkers experiencing day-after weakness, probably the combination of combat injuries, drug come down, and sheer physical exhaustion catching up once the altered state wore off. Dr. Howard Fabing's controversial 1956 psychiatric study suggested berserker behavior might have been a culture-bound syndrome, essentially a form of psychological conditioning reinforced by societal expectations and possibly triggered by substances. Think of it as method acting taken to homicidal extremes. Young warriors would train to enter these fugue states, learning to channel aggression while maintaining enough tactical awareness to be useful in battle, rather than just flailing wildly at friend and foe alike. The legal status of berserkers in Viking society was complicated. They were simultaneously honored as divine warriors and feared as unstable elements. Icelandic law codes from the 12th century specifically outlawed berserker behavior, suggesting that by then, the practice had become more problem than solution. There are accounts of berserkers challenging farmers to holmgang, formal duels, just to steal their land and wives, using their fearsome reputation to bully communities, not exactly the noble warrior ideal. You notice the other Vikings treating their berserker companion with a mixture of reverence and practicality, like he's a dangerous but essential tool. They're checking his weapons now, a massive two-handed axe that most people would struggle to lift, let alone swing in battle. The berserker handles it like it weighs nothing, muscle memory evident even in his somewhat sedated state. It makes you wonder, how much of berserker effectiveness was chemical enhancement versus years of conditioning and training? The berserker's eyes suddenly snap to the longhouse entrance, pupils still dilated but now laser-focused. Every Viking in the room tenses, hands moving to weapon hilts. Through the doorway stumbles something that makes your blood run cold. a figure in tattered burial clothes, skin grey as week-old ash, movements jerky and wrong like a marionette operated by a drunk puppeteer. The smell hits you next. Decomposition mixed with turned earth and something else, something older. Welcome to your first encounter with a Draugr. And no, this isn't just another mushroom-fueled Viking having a bad trip. The Vikings react with practiced efficiency, forming a defensive semicircle while muttering what sound like protective charms. Even the berserker, still coming down from his fungal journey, seems genuinely alarmed. The Draugr's eyes glow with a dim blue light, bioluminescence from grave fungi, perhaps, or something less scientifically comfortable. It carries a corroded sword and wears arm rings that mark it as someone of former importance, now reduced to this shambling horror. Draugr stories permeate Norse literature with disturbing consistency. These aren't your Hollywood zombies. They're conscious, malevolent, and superhumanly strong. The sagas describe them as greedy dead who refuse to stay buried, returning to guard their grave goods or torment the living. They could increase their size at will, control weather, and drive men mad with their presence. Grettir's saga gives us glamour, a Draugr so powerful it took the legendary hero Grettir the Strong to defeat him. And even then, Grettir was cursed with lifelong fear of the dark. What's genuinely unsettling is how specific and consistent these accounts are across different sources. Dr. Kirsten Wolf's analysis of medieval Icelandic texts reveals over 40 distinct Draugr encounters, each sharing core characteristics: immense strength, shape-changing abilities, and an obsession with treasure. The stories often include practical details, like how Draugr prefer to kill by crushing rather than using weapons, or how they must be beheaded and burned to prevent their return. This isn't typical folklore variants, it's more like a field guide. The Draugr in the longhouse moves with purpose toward a specific chest in the corner. Interesting, considering it shouldn't know the room's layout if it's just some random corpse. The Vikings clearly recognize it. You hear someone whisper Thorstein Ironsides with a mixture of fear and resignation. Apparently, this particular dead man has visited before. The concept of repeat hauntings appears throughout Viking Age accounts, suggesting these weren't one-off scares but ongoing community problems requiring management strategies. Archaeological evidence adds another layer of creepiness. Scandinavian burial sites from the Viking Age show clear signs of post-burial interference. Bodies decapitated, large stones placed on corpses, iron stakes driven through remains. Traditional archaeology interprets this as grave robbing, but the care taken to kill already dead bodies suggests something else. Why risk supernatural retribution by disturbing a grave unless you genuinely believe the occupant might get up and walk around? Dr. Matthias Egeler from Ludwig Maximilian University proposes that Draugr legends might stem from encounters with bodies preserved by bog conditions or permafrost. Imagine being a Viking farmer, digging a new foundation, and accidentally uncovering a centuries-old corpse that looks disturbingly fresh. Without modern understanding of preservation processes, you'd probably assume supernatural forces were at work, adding gases from decomposition causing bodies to move or make sounds, and you've got yourself a genuine undead situation. The Draugr has reached the chest now, running blackened fingers over its carved surface with disturbing familiarity. The lead Viking, you're starting to think of him as the chief, steps forward cautiously, speaking in formal, archaic Norse. He's negotiating, you realize. The sagas mention this too. Some Draugr could be reasoned with, striking bargains with the living, usually, These deals involved returning stolen grave goods or performing specific rituals. It's weirdly bureaucratic for supernatural horror. Medical historians have suggested that some Draugr accounts might describe people with catalepsy or other conditions causing death-like states who were accidentally buried alive. The superhuman strength could be explained by hysterical strength, that adrenaline-fueled boost that lets people lift cars off children. Escaping from a grave would certainly qualify as sufficient motivation. But this theory doesn't explain the repeated visits or the uncanny knowledge these creatures displayed about events occurring after their supposed deaths. The negotiation seems to be going poorly. The Draugr's voice, when it finally speaks, sounds like grinding millstones mixed with water gurgling through rotted lungs. Even without understanding Old Norse, you can tell it's making demands. The chief looks increasingly uncomfortable, glancing at his warriors as if calculating whether violence is worth the risk. Fighting Draugr was notoriously difficult. They could allegedly increase their weight until they were impossible to move, or slip through solid walls like smoke. You notice something odd about the Draugr's movements. They're becoming more fluid, more human-like, as if it's remembering how to inhabit its body properly. This progressive warming up appears in multiple saga accounts. Some scholars interpret this as metaphorical, representing how past conflicts resurface and escalate in communities. But watching this thing gradually coordinate its limbs with increasing skill makes you appreciate the literal interpretation. The other Vikings are preparing for violence now, but not with normal weapons, so they're pulling out specific items, silver jewelry, salt pouches, and what looks like a shirt made of polar bear fur, all materials mentioned in saga literature as effective against the undead. The berserker from earlier has sobered up remarkably fast and is coating his axe blade with some kind of oil. Even in their fear, there's a methodical quality to their preparations that speaks of experience. This isn't their first Draugr rodeo. Historians still argue whether Draugr beliefs reflected actual experiences with preservative burial conditions, represented metaphors for social conflicts, or stemmed from ergot poisoning causing mass hallucinations. What's undeniable is that Viking-age Scandinavians took these threats seriously enough to develop elaborate countermeasures, legal procedures for handling hauntings, and a rich mythology around the walking dead that makes modern zombie fiction look unimaginative by comparison. The Draugr negotiation ends abruptly when the longhouse doors slam open again, but nothing visible enters. Instead, you watch in horror as one of the younger Vikings suddenly drops to all fours, his body contorting in ways that make your joints ache in sympathy. His screams shift into howls, clothing tears as his frame expands, and within heartbeats where a man knelt, something wolf-like but wrong crouches. Its proportions are off, caught between human and beast, yellow eyes maintaining too much intelligence for comfort. The other Vikings immediately back away, even from their own comrade, because shape-shifting in Norse culture wasn't just mythology, it was a recognized, feared, and legally acknowledged phenomenon. The Jarl leading this merry band of nightmares steps forward, speaking in low, commanding tones to the wolf thing that was his warrior moments ago. What's disturbing is how unsurprised everyone seems. The Draugr actually pauses its chest fondling to watch with what might be professional interest. You're starting to realize that in Viking society, the boundaries between human and animal, living and dead, natural and supernatural were far more permeable than your modern mind wants to accept. Shapeshifting appears throughout Norse literature with unnerving consistency. The Volsunga saga describes Sigmund and Sinfjotli finding wolf pelts that transformed them into wolves for 10 days, The Ynglinga saga claims Odin himself could shapeshift, leaving his body comatose while his spirit inhabited animals. King Harald Fairhair's court supposedly included shape-shifting bodyguards. These weren't presented as fairy tales, but as historical accounts, recorded with the same matter-of-fact tone used for tax disputes and land ownership. Dr. Carlo Ginzburg's research into European shape-shifting beliefs reveals something fascinating. These stories follow specific patterns across cultures that had minimal contact. The transformation often involves an altered state of consciousness, animal skins or ointments, and occurs during liminal times like dusk or dawn. It's almost like different societies independently discovered similar techniques for something. Whether that something was psychological, pharmacological, or genuinely supernatural remains frustratingly unclear. The wolf warrior prowls the longhouse perimeter, sniffing at shadows with obvious agitation. You notice its movements perfectly blend human tactical awareness with lupine instinct, checking corners like a trained soldier, but using scent and hearing rather than sight. The other Vikings give it respectful space while maintaining formation. This isn't berserker fury, it's controlled, purposeful transformation. The sagas distinguish between berserkir, bear shirts, and ulfhedna, wolfskins, suggesting different types of shape-shifting warriors with distinct fighting styles and spiritual associations. Archaeological evidence adds credibility to these accounts in unexpected ways. Warrior graves from the Vendel and Viking periods often contain wolf and bear paraphernalia, teeth, claws, pelts, arranged in ritually significant patterns. The Torslanda helmet plates from Sweden depict warriors in wolf costumes performing what appears to be transformation dances. These aren't metaphorical representations. The detail suggests instruction manuals for achieving altered states. Modern anthropologists propose that Viking shape-shifting combined several elements: ritualistic use of animal skins, consciousness-altering substances, remember our mushroom-munching berserker from earlier, and intense psychological conditioning. Dr. Sabine Baringould's studies of lycanthropy note that believing you're an animal strongly enough can produce physiological changes, altered gait, increased aggression, even temporary changes in sensory perception. Add in a culture that absolutely believes in shape-shifting, and you've got a recipe for functional transformation. The wolf warrior suddenly freezes, head cocked toward sounds you can't hear. The Jarl nods as if receiving a report. Apparently, communication remains possible across species barriers. This detail appears repeatedly in sagas. Transformed warriors retained enough humanity to follow commands and relay information. It suggests shape-shifting served tactical purposes beyond just scaring enemies. Imagine facing an army that could send actual wolves as scouts. Except these wolves think with human intelligence and report back in detail. Legal texts from medieval Iceland treat shape-shifting as a real but problematic ability. The Gragas law code includes provisions for dealing with people who go about in animal form. Penalties ranged from minor fines to full outlawry, depending on whether harm was done while transformed. Think about that. An entire legal system acknowledging shape-shifting as factual enough to require regulation. These weren't superstitious peasants, but sophisticated lawmakers creating practical guidelines for supernatural problems. The tension in the longhouse ratchets up another notch as the wolf warrior's hackles rise. Through the smoke hole in the roof, you glimpse dark shapes circling, ravens, but too large and flying in patterns that suggest intelligence rather than instinct. The Jarl mutters something about thought and memory, which even you recognize as references to Hugin and Munin, Odin's information-gathering birds. The line between metaphor and reality blurs further. Historical accounts from Viking raid victims often mention warriors who fought like beasts, but also leaders who seemed to know impossible things, enemy positions, hidden valuables, optimal attack times. If Viking jarls really could project their consciousness into animals for reconnaissance, it would explain their uncanny tactical advantages. Or maybe they just had really good spy networks and enjoyed theatrical intimidation. The frustrating thing about Viking history is how often both explanations seem equally plausible. The wolf warrior begins to convulse again, the transformation reversing in a process that looks even more painful than the original change. Bones crack and reshape, fur retracts, and finally, a naked, shivering man collapses where the wolf thing stood. Other Vikings immediately wrap him in furs and force heated mead between his chattering teeth. The casual efficiency of their aftercare suggests this is routine. Just another Tuesday night in Viking land. What strikes you most is how shape-shifting serves social and military functions beyond mere combat. It marked certain individuals as liminal beings, existing between categories, capable of crossing boundaries others couldn't. In a culture obsessed with reputation and clearly defined social roles, shapeshifters occupied a unique position, honored but isolated, necessary but never quite trusted. They were living reminders that the ordered world of laws and oaths existed alongside something older and wilder. The newly human warrior is still shivering under his furs when the entire longhouse shudders, not from wind or earthquake, but from something massive brushing against the building's exterior walls. Through gaps in the timber, you glimpse scales the size of dinner plates sliding past, each one gleaming with an oily iridescence that hurts to look at directly. The sound is worse, a wet, rasping slide like a tongue the size of a sailing ship dragging across wood. Someone whispers, "Jormungandr," and even the hardened Vikings look genuinely afraid now, because while Draugr and shapeshifters are local problems, the world serpent represents cosmic terror on an entirely different scale. You remember Jormungandr from mythology class, Thor's nemesis, the serpent so large it encircles Midgard with its tail in its mouth. Cute story, right? Except Viking-age sailors didn't treat it as metaphor. Ship logs and runic inscriptions describe encounters with sea serpents in disturbingly practical terms. Disrupted trade routes, lost vessels, specific fjords avoided for generations. The Örvar Odd saga mentions sea monsters as navigational hazards alongside completely mundane concerns like fog and pirates. The serpentine presence outside moves on, leaving everyone in the longhouse visibly relieved, but also weirdly disappointed, like they'd simultaneously dreaded and hoped for a glimpse of something legendary. The Jarl starts telling a story, perhaps to calm nerves or fill the terrifying silence. He speaks of his grandfather's encounter off the coast of Greenland, a serpent longer than 3 longships, rising from calm seas to inspect their vessel with eyes like green fire pits. The crew survived by throwing all their trade goods overboard. Apparently, even cosmic monsters appreciate a good bribe. Dr. Hans Becker Nielsen's analysis of Viking-age maritime records reveals over 60 independent accounts of enormous sea creatures, clustered around specific geographic areas: the waters between Iceland and Greenland, the Norwegian Sea's deeper trenches, and curiously, certain Scottish lochs. These aren't vague "here be dragons" warnings, but detailed descriptions including behavior patterns, seasonal appearances, and successful avoidance strategies. It reads less like mythology and more like a medieval marine biology textbook. What's fascinating is how these accounts differentiate between various sea monsters. Jörmungandr-type serpents were apparently distinguishable from Havstramber, sea reindeer, Margigr, sea giantesses, and the Hafgufa, kraken-like creatures. Vikings had a whole taxonomy of maritime horrors, each with specific characteristics and threat levels. The precision suggests these categories emerged from actual encounters rather than pure imagination. After all, why invent multiple types of sea monsters when one would suffice for storytelling purposes? Modern science offers intriguing possibilities. The North Atlantic is home to several deep-sea species that surface rarely, but spectacularly. The oarfish can reach lengths of 36 feet and swims vertically, creating the illusion of a serpent rising from the depths. Giant squids, confirmed to exist only in 2004, match many kraken descriptions. Greenland sharks, which can live over 400 years and grow to 24 feet, exhibit the slow, purposeful movements Vikings attributed to sea serpents. Maybe Jörmungandr was less world serpent and more world's largest eel having a really bad day. The Longhouse discussion has shifted to practical matters, trade route adjustments based on recent serpent sightings. You're struck by how matter-of-factly they treat these creatures, like discussing traffic patterns or weather forecasts. One trader mentions losing cargo to a serpent near Ferryjar, Faroe Islands, but frames it as a calculated business risk rather than supernatural catastrophe. Another argues for taking the longer route around Scotland, citing 3 serpent encounters in as many months along the direct path. Historical climatologists note that the medieval warm period, roughly 950 to 1250 CE, coincided with increased reports of sea serpent sightings. Warmer waters might have altered migration patterns of deep-sea creatures, bringing them into contact with Viking shipping lanes. Dr. Lena Holmquist's research suggests that changes in ocean currents could have concentrated prey species in surface waters, attracting predators from the depths. Imagine being a Viking sailor and suddenly finding your familiar waters full of creatures you'd only heard about in grandfather's stories. The saga's descriptions of sea serpent behavior show surprising consistency with known marine biology. They surface more frequently during calm weather, when deep-sea creatures might follow prey upward. Avoid shallow waters, appropriate for large-bodied animals, and often appear curious rather than aggressive, typical of intelligent marine species encountering unfamiliar objects. Even the detail about serpents being attracted to metal sounds less magical when you consider how electromagnetic fields might affect creatures adapted to deep-sea navigation. You notice the Vikings performing what seems to be a protective ritual, carving bind runes into small wooden plaques and tossing them into the fire. The smoke carries a distinctly fishy smell, probably from whatever oil they're burning alongside the wood. These ward-setting practices appear throughout Norse literature, specific combinations of runes and materials designed to repel different threats. The fact that sea serpent wards were standardized enough to appear in multiple sources suggests either widespread delusion or widespread experience. The economic impact of sea serpent beliefs, or encounters, was substantial. Trade routes that should have been direct became circuitous, adding weeks to journeys. Certain fishing grounds were abandoned despite abundant catches. Insurance-like arrangements in Viking-age law codes specifically mention compensation for serpent-related losses, treating them as seriously as piracy or storms, or whether the serpents were real or not. Their effect on Viking Age maritime culture absolutely was. What makes Jörmungandr particularly terrifying in Norse cosmology isn't just its size, but what it represents. The boundary between the ordered world and primordial chaos. Every serpent sighting reminded Vikings that their carefully structured society existed on the edge of forces beyond human control or comprehension. The serpent's eventual role in Ragnarok, rising from the ocean to poison the sky with its breath, feels less like pure mythology and more like extrapolation from genuine encounters with incomprehensibly large sea life. The conversation about sea serpents dies abruptly when a horn sounds outside. Not the deep, brass call of war, but something higher, more mournful, like wind through a cracked bone. Every warrior in the longhouse immediately drops to one knee, including the Jarl, and you follow suit because when Vikings show deference, you really don't want to be the only one standing. Through the doorway drift 13 women, and calling them women feels inadequate. They move like smoke, their forms shifting between solid and translucent, wearing armor that gleams despite no light source, carrying spears that drip with something that isn't quite blood. The temperature drops 20 degrees, and your breath fogs as the Valkyries enter. The led Valkyrie surveys the room with eyes that have seen every battlefield from the world's beginning. When her gaze passes over you, it feels like being evaluated for something you desperately hope you'll fail. She speaks, and her voice carries harmonics that shouldn't come from a human throat. It's like a sword singing through air mixed with the last breath of dying warriors. Even without understanding the words, you know she's choosing. That's what Valkyrie do. They select which warriors die and which live, who earns Valhalla and who feeds ravens. Battlefield accounts from the Viking Age include disturbing consistency about supernatural women appearing during combat. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions death maidens at the Battle of Ashdown. Arabic sources describe ghostly women hovering over Norse warriors during Volga River conflicts. Irish annals reference battle crows in woman shape during Viking raids. These aren't poetic metaphors but eyewitness accounts from different cultures, all describing similar phenomena, female figures who seem to direct the flow of battle and mark certain warriors for death. Dr. Elsa Mundel's research into Valkyrie traditions reveals they weren't originally the beautiful psychopomps of later Romanticism, but something far more terrifying, embodiments of war's randomness and inevitability. Early sources describe them as corpse goddesses who delighted in bloodshed, weaving the fates of warriors on looms strung with intestines. The word Valkyrie itself means chooser of the slain, and that choosing wasn't portrayed as merciful, but as coldly tactical, serving Odin's need for Einherjar, eternal warriors, in his final battle. The Valkyrie leader moves through the longhouse, occasionally touching a warrior's shoulder. Those touched shudder, but look oddly honored, like they've received terrible news they've been expecting. One young warrior actually tears up when passed over, apparently devastated by this cosmic rejection. You're starting to understand that in Viking culture, being chosen for death by a Valkyrie wasn't just about dying, it was about dying correctly, with purpose. Your death serving the gods' grand design rather than random chance. What's genuinely unsettling is how Valkyrie sightings correlate with historically documented battles where Viking forces suffered near-total casualties but fought with unusual ferocity. The Battle of Hjörungavágr in 986 CE saw outnumbered Norwegian forces fight to the last man, with survivors reporting women in swan-white armor moving through their ranks before combat. Coincidence? Maybe. But similar accounts appear at Clontarf, Stamford Bridge, and other last stands where Vikings fought with what witnesses described as death joy. Modern historians propose various explanations: pre-battle hallucinations caused by ritual fasting, ergot-contaminated bread creating shared visions, or psychological warfare where Viking leaders employed women to play Valkyries and inspire troops. Dr. Neil Price suggests the most intriguing possibility: that Viking warriors trained themselves to perceive battlefield stress responses, tunnel vision, time dilation, auditory exclusion, as Valkyrie presence, literally seeing their adrenaline rush as divine selection. The Valkyries in the Longhouse begin to sing, and it's nothing like Wagner. This is discordant, utilizing overtones that make your teeth ache and your eyes water. The saga texts call it corpse song or spear din, and now you understand why. It sounds like metal tearing through flesh, like the moment between impact and pain. Several warriors join in, creating harmonies that shouldn't work but do, turning the Longhouse into a resonance chamber for controlled acoustic horror. Archaeological evidence offers its own mysteries. Weapon deposits in Scandinavian bogs often include female-associated items, brooches, beads, spindle whorls, arranged in patterns suggesting ritual significance. The Oseberg ship burial contained 2 women, one possibly a vulva, Ceres, along with weapons and what appears to be equipment for textile work. The connection between weaving and fate, between women's traditional crafts and cosmic warfare, runs deep in Norse culture. Valkyries were said to weave battle outcomes on supernatural looms, metaphor meeting reality in ways that resist clean categorization. The medical perspective is equally fascinating. Dr. Hilda Ellis Davidson noted that descriptions of Valkyrie-touched warriors match symptoms of specific pre-death experiences: peripheral vision darkening, sensation of presence, euphoria despite fatal wounds. The consistency across accounts suggests Vikings had identified and mythologized particular neurological states associated with combat death. They turned the biological process of dying into a spiritual narrative where brain chemistry became divine intervention. One of the younger Vikings suddenly convulses, eyes rolling back, speaking in a voice clearly not his own. The Valkyries stop singing and listen intently as he delivers what sounds like prophecy or battle plans. It's hard to tell which. This possession-like state, where Valkyries spoke through chosen warriors, appears throughout saga literature. Sometimes they delivered tactical intelligence, other times death pronouncements, occasionally both. The possessed warrior always survived these episodes, but remained marked, set apart from normal society. You realize the Valkyries haven't just come to choose. They're recruiting. The way they interact with these warriors suggests ongoing relationships, like case officers with assets. The sagas mention warriors who could see Valkyrie outside battle, who received warnings or guidance in dreams. This wasn't just about death, but about being incorporated into a supernatural intelligence network serving Odin's larger purposes. Every chosen warrior became a potential conduit for divine will, assuming they survived long enough to be useful. The Valkyrie fade like mist at dawn, leaving behind only the echo of their corpse song and warriors who look simultaneously honored and haunted. But the night's supernatural showcase apparently isn't over, because the Jarl now approaches a locked chest in the corner, one that's been humming with subtle menace since you arrived. He produces an elaborate key and opens it with the kind of careful movements you'd use around unstable explosives. Inside, wrapped in what looks like human hair and sealed with lead clasps, lies a sword, even sheathed and bound. It radiates wrongness. The temperature drops another few degrees, and you swear you can hear whispering, urgent and hungry. This is Tyrfing, though the Jarl doesn't speak its name aloud. Apparently, some words have power even when whispered. The other Vikings back away as he lifts it, still wrapped, handling it like a venomous snake that might strike through its cage. According to the sagas, Tyrfing was forged by dwarves under duress, cursed to kill whenever drawn, never to miss its target, and to always bring tragedy to its wielder. Fairy tale stuff, except the Vikings treat this curse as legally binding reality, complete with documentation and witness testimonies. The concept of cursed weapons appears throughout Norse literature with disturbing specificity. These weren't just unlucky swords, but weapons with documented behavioral patterns. Dain's life couldn't be sheathed until it had killed. Gram brought glory but guaranteed its wielder's doom. Skofnung made wounds that wouldn't heal unless treated with a specific stone. The detail level suggests these weren't generic curse narratives, but case studies of specific weapons with reputations built over generations of use. Dr. Preben Meulengracht. Sørenson's analysis of cursed weapon accounts reveals legal frameworks for managing them. Viking-age law codes include provisions for compensation for curse-caused deaths and procedures for properly disposing of malevolent weapons. The Frostathing law mentions weapons that turn against their owners as a recognized category requiring special handling. Imagine a society that needed actual legislation for managing murderously autonomous swords. The Jarl begins unwrapping Tyrfing with movements that mix reverence and revulsion. Each layer of binding removed increases the whispers, now clearly audible as Old Norse words. Blood, feed, strike, repeated in an endless loop. The sword itself, when finally revealed, is beautiful. Pattern-welded steel that flows like water, a grip wrapped in silver wire, pommel set with what might be starstone, meteorite iron. Beauty and malevolence aren't mutually exclusive in Norse cosmology. Often, they're intimately connected. Historical metallurgy offers partial explanations for weapon curses. Pattern-welded Damascus steel, which Vikings prized, required specific techniques that few smiths mastered. Improperly forged blades could shatter catastrophically in combat, betraying their wielders. Certain steel compositions were prone to stress fractures that made them dangerous to use. A sword that consistently failed or broke might earn a reputation as cursed, especially if multiple warriors died using it. But this doesn't explain the documented cases of weapons seeming to act with purposeful malevolence. The whispers from Tyrfing grow louder, more insistent, and you notice several warriors unconsciously reaching for their own weapons. Faces slack with something between desire and horror. The sagas describe cursed weapons as having their own will, compelling warriors to draw them at inappropriate times, during things, at religious ceremonies, against family members. The saga of Hrolfkraki mentions the sword Skofnung forcing its bearer to kill during a peaceful gathering, acting as if alive and thirsty. Archaeological evidence adds another disturbing dimension. Weapon deposits in bogs and lakes often show signs of deliberate destruction, blades bent into spirals, hilts removed, edges methodically blunted. Traditional interpretation assumes religious offerings, but the violence done to these weapons suggests something more like supernatural containment. Why destroy a valuable sword unless you genuinely believed it posed a threat? The effort involved in properly killing these weapons implies serious fear of their potential for autonomous action. The Jarl suddenly gasps and drops Tyrfing, which hits the floor with a sound like screaming metal. Where he gripped it, his palms show burns, though the sword wasn't hot. He quickly rewraps it while muttering what sound like apologies or placations. The other Vikings relax slightly once it's bound again, though everyone keeps eyeing the chest like it might explode. You're reminded of modern procedures for handling radioactive materials, layers of protection, minimal exposure time, careful documentation of everyone who comes in contact. Psychological explanations for weapon curses focus on confirmation bias and reputation effects. A sword known to be cursed would create anxiety in its wielder, potentially causing the mistakes that fulfill the curse. Dr. Regis Boyer suggests that curse narratives served as medieval product warnings, ways to encode information about dangerous weapons in memorable stories. But this doesn't explain accounts of cursed weapons performing impossible feats, cutting through stone, finding gaps in perfect armor, or moving on their own when left unattended. The most unsettling aspect is how Vikings managed cursed weapons as community resources despite their danger. Tyrfing and its ilk were too powerful to destroy, but too dangerous for regular use. They became nuclear options, brought out only in desperate circumstances and handled with elaborate precautions. The sagas mention entire family lines dedicated to guarding specific cursed weapons, passing down not just the blade but the knowledge of its management. It's simultaneously practical and insane. Imagine inheriting your grandfather's sword along with detailed instructions for preventing it from murdering you. The Jarl locks Tyrfing away with visible relief, but the damage is done. Several younger warriors still stare at the chest with naked longing, and you understand why cursed weapons persisted despite their dangers. The promise of a blade that never misses, that cuts through any armor, that guarantees victory. It's worth the risk of eventual doom, especially in a culture that valued glorious death over safe mediocrity, Every warrior in this room would probably accept Tyrfing if offered, curse and all. The tension from Tyrfing's display barely settles when a new group enters the longhouse, warriors, but different from the living Vikings around you. These men move with perfect synchronization, despite bearing wounds that should be fatal, spear holes through torsos, head split but somehow held together, limbs hanging by threads of flesh. They're semi-translucent, like fog given form, and their weapons shine with an otherworldly gleam. The living Vikings immediately make room with deep respect, because these are Einherjar, the honored dead who feast in Valhalla by night and train for Ragnarok by day. And apparently, sometimes they visit Midgard for recruiting purposes. The lead Einherjar, you can tell by the golden arm ring that seems more real than his actual arm, surveys the living warriors with an evaluator's eye. When he speaks, his voice echoes from somewhere beyond death, carrying the weight of battles fought across centuries. He's describing Valhalla, but not the paradise of eternal feasting you learned about in school. This is boot camp for the apocalypse, where death is just the entry requirement for an eternity of supernatural warfare training. According to the Einherjar, Valhalla's daily routine goes like this: wake at dawn, armor up, and fight to the death on the plains of Asgard. Not practice fighting, actual dismemberment, decapitation, the works. Come sunset, everyone resurrects, wounds heal instantly, and they feast on Sarimnir, the cosmic boar that regenerates nightly just to be slaughtered and eaten again. Between battles, they train with weapons that make Tyrfing look like a butter knife, study tactics against entities that exist in 11 dimensions, and prepare for opponents who make dragons look like garden snakes. Dr. Dassault. Jens Peter Schuurt's research into Einherjar beliefs reveals something fascinating. Viking warriors didn't see Valhalla as retirement, but as advanced placement. Death in battle wasn't the end goal. It was qualifying for the ultimate military program. The Einherjar visiting Midgard serve as recruiters, scouts, and quality control, ensuring only the best warriors join their ranks. It's less heroic afterlife and more special forces selection that happens to require dying first. The visiting Einherjar demonstrate combat techniques that shouldn't be possible. One passes his spear through his own chest to strike an imaginary opponent behind him, a move that would be suicidal for the living, but merely tactical when you're already dead. Another shows how to fight while literally dismembered, his severed arm continuing to swing its sword independently. The living Vikings watch with the intensity of students preparing for the world's deadliest final exam. What's particularly disturbing is how the sagas describe Einherjar maintaining earthly connections. They visit family members in dreams, appear at crucial battles to assist descendants, and sometimes manifest physically to deliver warnings or weapons. The Erbygjar saga mentions Einherjar teaching living warriors specific techniques for fighting Draugr. Apparently, different types of undead require different combat approaches. It's like having ancestors who not only watch over you, but actively provide military training from beyond the grave. Archaeological evidence for Einherjar beliefs appears in weapon burials showing signs of ritual killing, bending swords, breaking spear points, ensuring the weapons accompanied their owners to Valhalla in spiritually active form. The Valskada boat graves contained warriors buried with extensive equipment, far more than needed for display, arranged as if ready for immediate use. Some graves show evidence of post-burial additions, as if family members continued equipping their Einherjar relatives for otherworldly battles. The Einherjar leader starts calling out names, and several living warriors step forward. This isn't random selection. These men have apparently been marked for future recruitment through dreams, omens, or battlefield performance that caught Odin's attention. One young warrior proudly shows a scar that supposedly matches a wound received in a dream fight with an Einherjar. Another presents a raven feather that appeared in his locked weapon chest. The verification process is weirdly bureaucratic for supernatural recruitment. Medical anthropology offers interesting perspectives on Einherjar encounters. Dr. Carolina Kovala notes that near-death experiences in combat situations often include visions of deceased comrades offering guidance or encouragement. The consistency of these visions across cultures suggests neurological patterns, but Vikings interpreted them as literal Einherjar contact. They developed techniques for inducing such visions, controlled blood loss, specific breathing patterns, probably those mushrooms again, turning biological responses into spiritual technology. The demonstration continues with Einherjar showing how Valhalla's training addresses non-human opponents. They form shield walls against invisible giants, practice spear work against shapes that move in ways that hurt to track, demonstrate archery against targets that exist in multiple locations simultaneously. The living Vikings try to follow along, creating a surreal training session where half the participants are dead and the opponents are theoretical constructs of cosmic horror. You notice the Einherjar never fully solidify, maintaining a translucent quality that makes them hard to focus on directly. According to the sagas, this is because they exist partially in multiple worlds simultaneously, Valhalla, Midgard, and sometimes the battlefield dimensions where they practice fighting entities from outside reality. The strain of maintaining presence in our world limits their manifestation time, which is probably good because watching them demonstrate 11-dimensional combat techniques is giving you a migraine. The recruitment session ends with the Einherjar teaching a specific battle song, one that allegedly helps living warriors think like the honored dead. The lyrics are about embracing death as transformation rather than ending, seeing your current life as preparation for eternal warfare. It's simultaneously inspiring and deeply disturbing. Imagine a military culture so committed that death is just a career transition. The living Vikings sing along with enthusiasm that makes you glad not to be their enemy. The Einherjar fade back to Valhalla, leaving the living warriors energized and slightly unhinged from their training session with the honored dead. But the night's terrors aren't done with you yet. The Jarl orders everyone outside, and you follow, grateful for fresh air after the Longhouse's supernatural hotbox, until you see what he's planning. In the courtyard stands a pole, freshly carved with runes that seem to writhe in the torchlight, topped with a horse skull whose empty sockets somehow manage to glare with active malevolence. This is a Nidstong, a cursing pole, and the Vikings are about to demonstrate why these things were legally banned in Iceland after too many suspicious deaths. The preparation is disturbingly methodical. The horse skull isn't random. It comes from a stallion that belonged to their enemy, stolen specifically for this purpose. The pole itself is hazelwood, cut at midnight during a new moon, carved with runes that hurt to look at directly. Every detail matters in Nidstone construction, turning simple materials into a supernatural weapon of mass destruction. The Vikings treat this with more careful protocol than they showed for the cursed sword, which tells you everything about how seriously they take cursecraft. According to the sagas, a properly constructed Nidstone could bring plague, madness, and death to entire bloodlines. Egil's saga provides the most famous example. Egil Skallagrimsson erected a Nidstone against King Eric Bloodaxe and Queen Gunhild, forcing them to flee Norway. The saga treats this as historical fact, not metaphor, a magical WMD that actually worked. Legal codes from medieval Iceland ban Nidstone construction, with penalties ranging from full outlawry to execution, suggesting these weren't viewed as harmless folk practices, but genuine threats. Dr. Katharina Rauvera's analysis of Nidstone accounts reveals consistent elements. The curse pole must face the target's dwelling. Specific runes channel particular types of misfortune, and the horse skull serves as both amplifier and spiritual battery. The practice combines sympathetic magic, using something connected to the victim, runic power, and what seems to be weaponized prayer to malevolent spirits. It's incredibly sophisticated for something that supposedly doesn't work. The Jarl begins the activation ritual, and the atmosphere immediately changes. The temperature drops, but it's not natural cold. It feels like heat being actively drained from the area. The horse skull's jaw drops open and though no one touches it, and a sound emerges that's part scream, part wind, part something else that makes your primitive brain scream run. The other Vikings stand firm but clearly uncomfortable, muttering protective charms and fingering Thor's hammer amulets. Even believing in this stuff doesn't make experiencing it pleasant. What's genuinely disturbing is the historical record of Nidstone effectiveness. The Landnámabók records multiple instances of families fleeing Iceland after being targeted by curse poles, abandoning established farms rather than face supernatural assault. The Vatnsdæla saga describes a Nidstone causing a landslide that buried an entire household. Coincidence? Maybe. But the consistency of outcomes, targets dying, going mad, or fleeing within a year of pole erection, suggests either remarkable psychological warfare or something worse. The modern psychological explanation focuses on nocebo effects, negative expectations creating real symptoms. If you genuinely believe a curse pole will destroy your life, stress alone might cause illness, accidents through distraction, or social isolation, as others avoid the cursed. Dr. Kirsten Hastrup documented modern Icelandic communities where Nidstong fears still influence behavior, with families moving house after finding suspicious poles on their property. The belief itself becomes the active ingredient, but the Vikings add elements that transcend simple psychology. The Jarl produces a leather pouch and begins adding items to the pole's base. Hair from the target. How did they get that? Soil from their farmstead. And what looks disturbingly like dried blood. The specificity suggests intelligence gathering that would impress modern espionage agencies. They're not just cursing randomly, but building a targeted supernatural missile with biological guidance systems. The runes on the pole begin glowing, actually glowing, not metaphorically, with a sickly green phosphorescence that photographs would probably explain as foxfire or bioluminescent fungi, except the glow pulses in rhythm with the Jarl's chanting, brightening with each correctly pronounced formula. The other Vikings join in, creating harmonics that make the horse skull vibrate, its teeth chattering out additional rhythms. You're watching ancient technology whose operating manual we've lost, leaving only cargo cult recreations and academic speculation. Archaeological finds support Nidstong reality in unexpected ways. Post holes near Viking Age settlements sometimes contain horse skulls and runic inscriptions positioned to face specific directions, exactly as the sagas describe. The Trondheim excavations uncovered what appears to be a dismantled Nidstong, carefully broken and buried with counter-curse materials. Why go to such trouble for something that doesn't work? The effort involved in both creating and neutralizing these poles suggests genuine fear of their power. The worst part is how Nidstong curses allegedly worked across distance, with no direct contact required. The sagas describe targets falling ill simultaneously with pole erection hundreds of miles away, their health declining in specific patterns, matching the carved runes. One account mentions a curse pole causing its target's livestock to die in order of value. First the prize bull, then the best milking cows, down to the chickens, displaying an intelligence in its malevolence that random coincidence doesn't explain. Legal remedies for Nidstong attacks were complex and expensive. You could hire specialists to erect counter-curse poles, perform elaborate cleansing rituals, or negotiate with the curse caster for removal. The Gragas law code includes provisions for curse arbitration, with standardized compensation rates for different Nidstong effects. Imagine a legal system that needs price lists for supernatural assault, 3 cows for madness, 6 for death, full blood money for familial extinction. The activation ritual climaxes with the Jarl driving the pole deep into the earth, aligned precisely with the target's location. The horse skull screams, definitely screams, not wind through bone, and then falls silent. The pole stands there, innocuous looking, except for the way shadows bend wrong around it, and how no insects will fly through its vicinity. The Vikings quickly retreat inside, nobody wanting to linger near an active curse weapon. You follow, wondering if you'll ever feel warm again after witnessing weaponized malevolence given physical form. Back inside the longhouse, you're still shivering from the Nidstong demonstration, when a new commotion starts. The warriors suddenly scramble for weapons, real fear in their eyes, not the respectful wariness they showed the Valkyries or Einar, but primal terror. Through the smoke hole comes a howl that doesn't belong to any wolf you've ever heard. It's too deep, too long, carrying harmonics that suggest a throat larger than any natural predator. Someone whispers Fenrir's spawn, and you realize the Vikings' fear of wolves goes far beyond normal predator concerns into cosmic horror territory. The Jarl bars the door with a beam that takes 3 men to lift, then orders everyone into defensive positions. This isn't their first wolf siege, apparently. Through gaps in the timber walls, you glimpse shapes moving outside, wolf-like but wrong, proportioned more like bears but moving with lupine grace. Their eyes reflect torchlight in colors that shouldn't exist, and their breath steams in the cold air like forge smoke. These aren't ordinary wolves or even dire wolves, but something that makes you understand why Fenrir, the wolf destined to devour Odin, haunts Norse nightmares. Fenrir himself remains bound until Ragnarok, according to mythology, but his children roam free. The sagas mention Skjold and Hati, who chase the sun and moon, and numerous unnamed offspring that plague Midgard. What's disturbing is how Viking Age accounts treat these supernatural wolves as practical threats requiring specific countermeasures. The Orkneyinga saga describes wolf attacks that left victims not just dead, but marked by chaos, their bodies showing signs of corruption that spread to anyone who touched them without proper protection. Dr. Gro Steinsland's research into Norse wolf symbolism reveals layers of meaning beyond simple predator fear. Wolves represented the antithesis of civilization, not just wild, but actively anti-order, creatures that existed to unmake human achievements. The binding of Fenrir wasn't just subduing a monster, but temporarily containing entropy itself. Every wolf attack reminded Vikings that this containment was temporary, that chaos literally howled at their doors waiting for weakness. The wolves outside begin testing the longhouse's defenses, not randomly but systematically. They scratch at specific joints in the timber, probe the door's hinges, investigate the smoke hole's accessibility. This isn't animal behavior but tactical assessment. The sagas describe Fenrir's children as possessing human-level intelligence combined with divine malevolence. Imagine wolves that can plan, hold grudges, and understand the concept of revenge. The Vikings' fear suddenly seems entirely rational. One wolf manages to force its head through a gap in the wall, and you see it clearly for the first time. The proportions are all wrong. Jaws that unhinge wider than physically possible. Teeth that seem to exist in more rows than fit in its mouth. Eyes that track multiple targets simultaneously. When the Vikings drive spears at it, the wolf doesn't just retreat but laughs, actually laughs. A sound that will haunt your dreams forever. It speaks in Old Norse, promising creative dismemberments, showing linguistic sophistication that wolves absolutely shouldn't possess. Archaeological evidence for wolf terror appears in settlement patterns. Viking Age farms often featured specialized anti-wolf fortifications beyond normal predator deterrence. Silver nails in door frames, runic wards carved into support beams, offerings buried at cardinal points. The effort invested suggests these weren't just spiritual precautions, but responses to genuine threats. Mass grave sites in Norway show victims with bite patterns that don't match known wolf anatomy, wounds too large and deliberate for normal predation. The wolves coordinate their assault, some attacking the walls while others dig under the foundation. The Vikings respond with practiced efficiency, hot oil poured through murder holes, silver-tipped spears for creatures that shrug off iron, and constant chanting of what sound like binding formulas. You notice they're not trying to kill the wolves but contain them, drive them off, apparently. Fenrir's children can't be permanently destroyed, only temporarily discouraged. Historical records from monastery chronicles describe Viking raids preceded by demon wolves that terrorize populations into submission. Initially dismissed as propaganda, these accounts gain credibility when compared with Norse sources describing Ulfhednar warriors and their spirit wolf allies. The line between shape-shifted humans, supernatural wolves, and psychological warfare blurs into tactical uncertainty. How do you defend against enemies that might be men, beasts, or something between? The alpha wolf, if that term even applies to these nightmares, approaches the door directly. It's massive, shoulder height to the tallest warrior, with fur that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. When it speaks this time, its voice carries command authority that makes several younger Vikings step back involuntarily. It's negotiating, offering safe passage in exchange for something specific. You catch references to a stolen pup, accusations of oath-breaking, demands for weregild. These cosmic monsters apparently follow legal procedures. The Jarl negotiates through the barred door, his voice carefully formal. The exchange reveals a complex relationship between human and supernatural wolf communities, treaties, territorial agreements, compensation schedules for livestock losses versus human deaths. It's bizarre hearing contract law discussed with entities that embody primal chaos, but the Vikings treat it as routine. The sagas mention similar arrangements, suggesting coexistence through carefully maintained legal frameworks with forces that could otherwise destroy human settlement. You realize Fenrir's binding might be less mythological and more legal precedent, the gods containing chaos through contract rather than pure force. Every agreement with his children reinforces or weakens that original binding. The wolves outside aren't just predators but legal entities pursuing legitimate grievances through established channels. They're choosing negotiation over annihilation, which is somehow more terrifying than mindless aggression. The negotiation concludes with the Jarl sending out a silver arm ring and what looks like a treaty amendment carved in wood. The alpha wolf examines both with disturbing thoroughness before accepting. The pack withdraws, but not before the alpha fixes you with a stare that suggests you've been catalogued for future reference. The message is clear. Civilization exists because chaos permits it, and that permission is negotiable, revocable, subject to terms and conditions that humans violate at existential peril. The wolf pack's departure leaves everyone exhausted. But there's no rest in this nightmare tour of Viking terrors. A sudden wind howls through the longhouse, not from outside but manifesting inside, swirling around the central fire pit without disturbing the flames. The temperature plummets, then soars, then drops again in nauseating waves. Someone shouts, "Seder," and the Vikings form a protective circle, backs to the fire. As reality starts behaving inappropriately, objects levitate slightly, shadows move independent of their sources, and the smoke from the fire forms shapes that look disturbingly like reaching hands. A figure emerges from literally nowhere, one moment empty air, the next a woman standing there as if she'd always been. She's dressed in a blue cloak covered with stones that gleam with their own light, carrying a staff topped with brass fittings that hurt to look at directly. This is a Volva, a cedar practitioner, and judging by the Vikings' mix of respect and barely controlled panic, she's powerful. When she speaks, the wind dances, gusting in rhythm with her words. The fire dims and brightens according to her breathing. You're watching someone who treats natural law as a polite suggestion. Seda represents the part of Norse magic that even Vikings found unsettling. While rune magic and curses followed comprehensible rules, Seda dealt with fundamental forces, weather, fate, the boundaries between worlds. Practitioners could supposedly travel in spirit form, resurrect the dead for questioning, and alter probability itself. The practice was considered ergi, unmanly, for men, associated with feminine power and Freya's teachings, which didn't stop male practitioners but did complicate their social standing. Dr. Clive Tolley's extensive study of Seda practices reveals a sophisticated system combining shamanic techniques, pharmaceutical knowledge, and what appears to be practical quantum mechanics minus the math. Practitioners use drumming, chanting, and yes, those ubiquitous mushrooms, but also complex ritual frameworks designed to shift consciousness into states where normal causality became negotiable. The consistency of described effects across sources suggests either widespread hallucination or actual manipulation of reality. The vulva begins her demonstration by calling winds. Not metaphorically, she whispers something. And suddenly, there's a localized tornado in the longhouse, strong enough to lift warriors off their feet, but somehow leaving the fire untouched. She changes its direction with hand gestures, splits it into multiple smaller whirlwinds, then dismisses it entirely. The casual control is terrifying. The sagas describe Seda practitioners selling wind to sailors, cursing enemies with storms, and clearing battlefield fog with a word. Weather terrorism with supernatural precision. Next, she produces a small cloth bag and scatters its contents into the fire. The smoke immediately thickens, forming a dome that traps everyone inside. Within this smoke, shapes appear. Not vague suggestions, but clear images of distant places. You see a battlefield where the outcome shifts as she manipulates unseen threads. Warriors who should die surviving, others falling to impossible accidents. She's showing how Seda can alter probability, nudging events toward desired outcomes through what Vikings called fate weaving. Historical accounts of Seda weather control cluster around specific events. The Battle of Hjörungavágr supposedly turned when Håkon Sigurdsson's Seda practitioners summoned a hailstorm that struck only enemy forces. The Ferryinga saga describes a weather witch who held an entire fleet in harbour for weeks with contrary winds, negotiating increasing payments until satisfied. These aren't portrayed as coincidences, but as documented magical attacks with specific perpetrators and methodologies. The vulva's demonstration escalates. She strikes her staff against the floor 3 times, and suddenly you're not entirely in the longhouse anymore. The walls become translucent, showing glimpses of other places, a snow-covered forest, a battlefield, what might be the bottom of the ocean. She's thinning the boundaries between worlds, demonstrating the Seda practitioner's ability to exist in multiple realities simultaneously. The sensation is nauseating, like motion sickness of the soul. Archaeological evidence for Seda practice includes specialized grave goods, staffs with specific metal compositions, chairs designed for trance postures, and botanical remains of psychoactive plants beyond the usual suspects. The Oseberg ship burial's Buddha bucket contains residue of cannabis, henbane, and other consciousness-altering substances in combinations suggesting pharmaceutical precision rather than random experimentation. These weren't recreational users but professionals with standardized toolkits. The vulva now demonstrates the darkest Seda art, necromancy. She produces what looks like a shoulder blade covered in runes and begins a chant that makes everyone deeply uncomfortable. The temperature drops so fast frost forms on metal surfaces, and in the smoke above the fire, a face appears, not imagined or suggested but clearly visible, mouth moving, eyes tracking the living. She summons someone's dead relative for consultation, and the conversation that follows is too specific, too accurate to be cold reading or lucky guesses. Medical anthropology suggests Seder practitioners were among history's first psychonauts, deliberately exploring altered consciousness with scientific methodology. The rituals consist in elements, sensory deprivation, rhythmic stimulation, careful dosing of psychoactives, parallel modern consciousness research. Dr. Jenny Blaine argues these weren't primitive shamans, but sophisticated practitioners who mapped non-ordinary states with the rigor of cartographers, finding reproducible paths to specific effects. The demonstration climaxes with the vulva showing her ultimate power, Seder combat. She gestures at one warrior, and he suddenly clutches his chest, gasping. Another gesture, and he recovers. But now his neighbor doubles over with stomach cramps. She's attacking with invisible forces, demonstrating how Seder practitioners could kill without touching, without even being present. The sagas describe whole armies struck down by Seder sickness, previously attributed to psychological warfare, but watching this display makes you reconsider. The vulva concludes by restoring everything to normal with disturbing ease. The smoke clears, temperatures stabilize, and reality firms up its boundaries. But she leaves a parting gift, or threat. Each Viking finds a small object in their possession that wasn't there before. A stone, a feather, a piece of twisted metal. She explains these are connections, allowing her to find them wherever they go. The implications are clear. Seder practitioners don't just visit and leave, but establish networks of influence that persist. You check your own pockets and find a small bone carved with runes you really hope aren't personalized. The vulva's departure leaves everyone unsettled, but the night of terrors continues its relentless parade. A new smell permeates the longhouse, decay mixed with something medicinal, like herbs failing to mask putrefaction. Several Vikings suddenly clutch their stomachs, and one young warrior collapses, his skin erupting in black boils that spread visibly across his body. Within moments, 3 more fall. Same symptoms, same terrifying speed. Someone screams, "Hell's messengers," and panic erupts as everyone realizes they're witnessing supernatural plague, delivered by servants of the goddess of death herself. The Jarl immediately orders the afflicted isolated, but it's already too late. The sickness spreads by proximity, but also by fear. Those who show terror seem more susceptible, as if the disease feeds on negative emotion. Through the smoke and chaos, you glimpse them, tall figures in tattered robes, neither fully visible nor completely invisible, gliding between the sick with purposeful movements. They touch foreheads, whisper names, and mark certain individuals while passing others. These are Hell's collectors, and they're not spreading disease randomly but selecting specific victims for their mistress's realm. Hel, daughter of Loki, rules the Norse underworld where those who die of sickness or old age go. Not the glorious Valhalla, but a grey realm of quiet suffering. Her servants, according to the sagas, periodically enter Midgard to collect quotas, spreading diseases that kill in patterns too deliberate for natural plague. The Erbygjar saga describes a death-field sickness that moved through a district following ley lines. taking specific bloodlines while sparing others. Survivors reported seeing grey women measuring the sick with invisible threads before they died. Dr. B. Folkestrom's analysis of plague narratives in saga literature reveals disturbing consistencies. Hell's diseases didn't spread like normal infections, but followed rules. They could skip generations, lie dormant in specific locations, and activate when particular conditions were met. One account describes a family curse where every third son died of the same wasting sickness at age 33, preceded by dreams of grey women calling their names. Genetic disease? Maybe. But the precision suggests something more deliberately malevolent. The sickness in the longhouse accelerates horrifically. The boils on the first victim burst, releasing not pus but what looks like tiny black insects that immediately seek new hosts. Those they touch develop different symptoms. Some age rapidly, hair whitening and skin wrinkling in minutes. Others grow cold, their breath misting as their body temperature drops toward corpse levels while they remain conscious. It's like watching a supernatural weapons test where each variant targets different biological systems. The Vikings respond with practiced epidemic protocols that blend practical quarantine with spiritual warfare. They create barrier circles with salt and iron filings, burn specific herbs that make breathing difficult, but apparently repel hell servants, and begin reciting genealogies, apparently. Knowing your complete ancestry provides some protection against death collectors who need to verify their targets. The fact they have standardized procedures for supernatural plague outbreaks tells you how common these events were. Historical plague accounts from the Viking Age show patterns that puzzle epidemiologists. The 995 CE outbreak in Iceland killed exactly 1/3 of the population. Not approximately, but exactly, according to multiple sources. The disease followed property lines rather than population density, suggesting either incredible coincidence or deliberate targeting. Mass graves from this period show victims who died simultaneously, despite being separated by distances that should have prevented synchronized infection. One of hell's servants becomes fully visible, perhaps intentionally, and you immediately wish it hadn't. The figure is symmetrical but wrong. One half appears as a beautiful woman, the other as a corpse in advanced decay. When it speaks, addressing the Jarl directly, its voice harmonizes with itself, living and dead tones creating acoustic horror. It's demanding someone specific, naming a warrior who broke an oath to a dying man. The saga theme of supernatural justice through disease appears literally before your eyes. The negotiation that follows is even more disturbing than the wolf treaties. Hell's servant presents documentation, actual scrolls that materialize from nowhere, listing violations, penalties, and payment options. Apparently, the goddess of death runs a bureaucracy that makes modern tax agencies look lenient. The Jarl can pay in lives, specific ones, not random, in years, literally shortening lifespans of volunteers, or in service, sending warriors to guard hell's borders against something worse. Every option is horrible, but refusing means everyone dies. Archaeological evidence supports ritualized responses to supernatural plagues. Mass burial sites often include boundary stones with specific runic inscriptions, positioned to create geometric patterns around infected areas. Grave goods from plague victims differ from battle deaths, more protective amulets, specific herb bundles, and sometimes lead tablets with what appear to be contracts or negotiations with death entities. The infrastructure for managing divine disease was extensive and standardized. The biological horror escalates. One warrior's blood turns black and viscous, moving sluggishly through visible veins. Another begins speaking in tongues, not glossolalia, but actual languages he shouldn't know, reciting what sound like obituaries for people not yet dead. The preciseness of these torments suggests Hell's servants aren't just spreading disease, but conducting field experiments in mortality, testing new death variants on human subjects. You watch the Jarl make his choice, selecting the Oathbreaker for surrender to Hell's justice. The marked warrior accepts his fate with Viking stoicism, but asks for time to settle affairs. The death servant agrees, apparently. They have schedules to maintain. It produces an hourglass filled with what looks like bone dust, sets it on the table, and states the warrior will die when the last grain falls. The casualness of scheduling someone's death like a business appointment is somehow worse than immediate execution. The plague recedes as quickly as it came, Hell's servants fading back to invisibility once their business concludes, but they leave reminders. Each survivor bears a small mark, invisible except in certain light, that apparently registers them in Hell's archives. You've been catalogued in Death's database, your eventual demise pre-filed for processing. The Vikings treat this as normal, comparing marks and discussing which afterlife realm has strongest claim on their souls. The bureaucratization of death makes it infinitely more terrifying than simple mortality. The plague marks are still fresh on everyone's skin when a raven flies through the smoke hole. Not unusual, except this one's the size of an eagle, and its eyes show disturbing intelligence. It perches on a beam and begins speaking in perfectly articulated Old Norse, delivering what sounds like a military intelligence report. 2 more oversized ravens follow, each adding details about troop movements, hidden supply caches, and personal secrets of various jarls that make several warriors visibly uncomfortable. These are Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, Odin's personal reconnaissance network, and their presence means the Allfather is taking direct interest in current events. The ravens demonstrate their legendary abilities by reciting conversations that happened in locked rooms, describing the contents of sealed letters, and most unnervingly, narrating people's private thoughts from the past week. One warrior goes pale when a raven casually mentions his plan to desert, complete with the location where he'd hidden stolen gold. Another looks sick as his affair with his brother's wife gets aired in public. The birds aren't just scouts, but divine surveillance incarnate, and apparently, Odin's been watching everyone. Historical accounts treat Hugin and Munin as metaphorical representations of Odin's wisdom, but Viking Age sources describe them quite literally. The Heimskringla mentions Danish kings consulting captured ravens that could speak, treating them as enemy intelligence assets. Arab chroniclers describe Norse chieftains who spoke with birds, receiving impossible tactical advantages. Ibn Fadlan specifically notes ravens that whispered secrets to Viking leaders during his famous embassy to the Volga Vikings. Dr. Bernd Heinrich, combining Corvid biology with Norse studies, points out that ravens are eerily intelligent. They use tools, plan future actions, and communicate complex information. Viking raiders definitely used ravens for navigation. The famous raven banners were practical as well as symbolic. But saga descriptions go beyond normal animal behavior into something unsettling. Ravens that report specific conversations, identify individuals by name, and predict enemy movements with perfect accuracy aren't just smart birds. The lead raven, distinguishable by silver feathers threaded through its black wings, begins interrogating the assembled Vikings, Its questions are pointed, specific, designed to reveal hidden motivations and conflicts. When someone lies, the raven cocks its head and repeats the question with details that make deception impossible. It's conducting a security audit with supernatural polygraph capabilities, and several warriors confess to crimes rather than risk whatever punishment comes from lying to Odin's direct servants. Archaeological evidence for the Raven intelligence network appears in unexpected places. Runestones often include raven imagery with inscription patterns, suggesting coded messages. Certain high-status Viking burials include raven skulls positioned to watch specific directions, sometimes with tiny scroll cases attached to leg bones. Were these symbolic? Or did Viking intelligence networks literally use trained ravens for communication? The infrastructure suggests organized avian espionage programs. The ravens shift from interrogation to instruction, teaching the Vikings a complex whistle language that apparently allows basic communication with ordinary ravens. The demonstration is unnerving. Local wild ravens respond to specific calls, gathering information and returning with accurate reports about surrounding areas. Within minutes, the Vikings have real-time intelligence about every approach to the longhouse, reported by birds that shouldn't understand human tactical needs, but clearly do. Medieval bestiaries describe Odin's ravens as a separate species from common ravens, capable of understanding all languages and traveling between worlds. While ornithology doesn't support supernatural subspecies, the Vikings certainly bred and trained ravens selectively. Genetic analysis of raven remains from Viking Age sites shows unusual homogeneity in certain populations, suggesting breeding programs. Combined with the saga's training methods, feeding ravens specific diets, raising them with human speech from hatching, possible use of those psychoactive mushrooms, you get birds that transcend normal animal limitations. The intelligence briefing becomes interactive as the ravens project images into the smoke above the fire. Not vague shapes, but detailed tactical maps showing enemy positions, fortification weaknesses, and optimal attack routes. The information is impossibly current, showing guard changes happening right now miles away. Either these ravens violate physics with faster-than-light travel, or they're accessing information through methods that make quantum entanglement look primitive. You notice the ravens occasionally speak in unison, their voices harmonizing to create sounds no single throat could produce. When this happens, the temperature drops and everyone feels watched by something beyond the birds. The sagas describe this as Odin speaking through his servants, divine consciousness temporarily inhabiting Corvid networks. It's distributed intelligence before computers, using biological hardware to create a surveillance network spanning continents. The briefing concludes with the ravens delivering personal messages to specific warriors. Some receive praise for valor even Odin noticed. Others get warnings about impending betrayals. A few are marked for special attention in ways that make them alternately proud and terrified. One young warrior receives a black feather that immediately bonds to his skin like a tattoo. He's been recruited into Odin's intelligence network, granted the ability to understand raven speech, but obligated to serve as a human node in the divine surveillance system. The most disturbing revelation comes last. The ravens explain that they don't just observe current events, but remember everything they've seen since the world's beginning. They casually reference conversations from centuries ago, describe the youth of now ancient Jarls, and worst of all, predict future events with unnerving accuracy based on pattern recognition across millennia. Thought and memory aren't just Odin's pets, but living databases of everything that has been and statistical models of what will be. As the ravens prepare to leave, they offer a demonstration of their ultimate capability. One flies to each corner of the longhouse, and suddenly you're seeing through their eyes simultaneously, 3 viewpoints overlapping in your mind, showing the building from angles impossible for human perception. The disorientation is extreme but enlightening. This is how Odin sees the world, through thousands of raven eyes simultaneously, processing parallel data streams into omniscient awareness. No wonder he's called all-seeing. The ravens depart, but their intelligence briefing proves tragically relevant within moments. The sky outside turns an impossible color, bruised purple-green like infected flesh, and the ground trembles with rhythms that feel more like breathing than earthquakes. Through the longhouse walls comes a sound that shouldn't exist, the groaning of wood that hasn't grown yet mixed with the death cries of animals not yet born. Someone whispers Ragnarok signs, and even these hardened Vikings, who faced every terror this night has offered, look genuinely afraid, because while everything else has been local horror, this threatens existence itself. The environmental anomalies escalate rapidly. Snow begins falling upward, defying gravity while still accumulating on the ground. The fire in the central pit burns cold, frosting the air while still somehow providing light. Through the smoke hole, you glimpse stars moving visibly across the sky, constellations rearranging themselves into patterns that spell doom in cosmic calligraphy. These are the portents the Völuspá warns about, the signs that the world tree Yggdrasil is dying and taking all 9 realms with it. Historical records from the Viking Age document numerous Ragnarok scares, where communities believed the end had begun. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions the winter of 1046 to 47, when the sun turned black at midday and beasts spoke with human voices. Irish annals record synchronized volcanic eruptions, blood-red precipitation, and mass animal die-offs that sent Norse settlers fleeing back to Scandinavia. These weren't metaphorical descriptions, but eyewitness accounts of environmental catastrophes that matched mythological predictions too closely for comfort. Dr. Bo Gresland's climate research reveals that many Ragnarok prophecies align with actual environmental disasters. The Fimbul winter, 3 years of continuous winter preceding the end, corresponds to volcanic winter events like the 536 CE atmospheric catastrophe that dropped global temperatures and caused widespread famine. When your mythology includes accurate descriptions of nuclear winter effects centuries before nuclear weapons, coincidence becomes insufficient explanation. The portents intensify inside the longhouse. Metal objects begin rusting at visible speed. Decades of oxidation compressed into seconds. Fresh food rots instantly, while preserved meats restore themselves to living flesh that screams before re-dying. Time itself has become non-linear, effect preceding cause in nauseating loops. Several warriors age rapidly, then youthen, then age again, trapped in temporal oscillations that leave them disoriented and exhausted. You're witnessing entropy increase and decrease simultaneously. Fundamental laws of physics having a nervous breakdown. The Jarl attempts to maintain order by initiating protective rituals, but even these go wrong. Runes carved for warding spell out prophecies of doom instead. Sacred mead turns to blood in cups, then to poison, then to something that exists in too many states simultaneously to have a single name. The vulva's earlier reality manipulations look like parlor tricks compared to this cosmic unwinding. You understand why Vikings feared Ragnarok more than death. Death at least follows rules. Archaeological evidence for Ragnarok preparations appears throughout Scandinavia. Burial hoards from the Viking Age often include emergency supplies clearly meant for post-apocalyptic survival, seeds in specially sealed containers, tools for rebuilding civilization, and runic instructions for future generations. The Ruck runestone, Sweden's longest runic inscription, includes what runologists interpret as a survival manual disguised as mythological poetry, encoding practical information about recognizing and surviving Ragnarok events. The environmental chaos reaches new heights as the building's wooden supports begin growing leaves and branches. The dead timber remembering life. But it's wrong life. The leaves are autumn colors despite growing fresh, falling upward to root in the ceiling. One support beam transforms entirely into a sapling that ages to ancient tree and back to seed in moments, cycling through centuries of existence in heartbeats. The longhouse has become temporarily unstuck, existing in all moments of its existence simultaneously. Outside, the howling isn't wind but voices, millions of them, in languages that won't be invented for centuries, mixed with tongues dead before the ice melted. Through gaps in the walls, you see impossible sights, sailing ships flying through the air, mountains walking like giants, the sea burning while fire flows like water. The orderly world is coming apart at its conceptual seams, categories bleeding into each other as fundamental distinctions dissolve. The Vikings respond with fatalistic preparation rather than panic. They begin distributing grave goods among the living, ensuring everyone has proper equipment for whatever afterlife awaits when existence ends. Weapons are blessed and cursed simultaneously, hedging metaphysical bets. Warriors confess secrets and settle debts, clearing spiritual accounts before the final audit. There's something deeply moving about people facing cosmic annihilation with the same practical efficiency they'd use for seasonal farming. Scientific parallels to Ragnarok scenarios have become disturbingly plausible. Climate change, ecosystem collapse, solar flares, supervolcanic eruptions, modern existential threats that mirror mythological predictions. The Vikings encoded real environmental dangers into religious narrative, creating a mythology that doubles as disaster preparedness training. Their Ragnarok wasn't just about gods dying, but about recognizing and potentially surviving civilization-ending events. The climax comes when Yggdrasil itself becomes visible, the world tree superimposed over reality like a cosmic X-ray. Its roots writhe in pain. Its branches shed leaves that are somehow entire worlds dying. And at its base, you glimpse something gnawing, Nidhugger, the dragon that chews at reality's foundations. The sight is sanity blasting, too large and significant for human minds to process. Several warriors simply stop, standing slack-jawed as their consciousness fails to accommodate cosmic truth. But then, as suddenly as they began, the portents fade. The world reasserts its familiar physics. Time flows properly forward, and the environmental chaos subsides. The Vikings slowly recover, comparing experiences and realizing they've survived another Ragnarok false alarm. These happen periodically, they explain. Reality hiccups that preview the eventual end. Each survival is celebrated but also mourned, because it means the cosmic countdown continues toward the inevitable conclusion. The Ragnarok portents have barely faded when the Jarl announces the evening's final horror, one that makes even battle-hardened Vikings shift uncomfortably. He gestures toward a corner where several thralls, slaves, sit quietly, and your stomach drops as you realize what's coming. These aren't prisoners of war or criminals, but volunteers who've agreed to be buried alive with their master when he dies, ensuring he has servants in the afterlife. Tonight, they're demonstrating the preparation rituals, and the casual way everyone treats this makes it more terrifying than all the supernatural horrors combined. The lead thrall, a woman who can't be older than 20, explains the process with disturbing enthusiasm. She's been preparing for this honor since childhood, learning specific skills the Jarl will need in death, not just cooking and cleaning, but navigation through the afterlife realms, diplomatic phrases in the languages of the dead, and techniques for appeasing various underworld entities. She shows ritual scars where she's been pre-killed in ceremonies, partially severing her connection to life so the transition will be smoother. Her pride in this preparation is heartbreaking. Archaeological evidence for living burial is extensive and horrifying. The Oseberg ship burial contained 2 women, one elderly and high status, the other young with a crushed skull, suggesting she didn't die naturally. DNA analysis revealed they weren't related, supporting the thrall burial hypothesis. Mass graves at Trelleborg show individuals buried simultaneously with a central figure, positioned as if serving even in death. Some show evidence of poisoning, others of strangulation, but many display no violent death markers, suggesting they entered their graves alive. Dr. B. Neil Price's analysis of Viking burial practices reveals gradations of horror. Some thralls were drugged into compliance. Others went willingly, believing in their posthumous importance. The Flate Jarbok describes a funeral where thralls competed for the honor of accompanying their lord, with losers genuinely disappointed. The intersection of religious belief, social pressure, and economic reality created conditions where being buried alive seemed preferable to surviving in poverty and dishonor. The thralls demonstrate their funeral preparations, and it's like watching people cheerfully plan their own murders. They've sewn special garments with pockets for grave goods, practiced lying still in confined spaces, and learned breathing techniques to extend consciousness during burial. One young man shows how he's trained his body to require less oxygen through meditation and gradual suffocation exercises. They're optimizing their own deaths for maximum effectiveness, approaching living burial as a technical challenge. The actual burial process, as they explain it, involves careful timing. Thralls enter the burial chamber first, arranging grave goods and preparing the space. The dead lord is placed centrally. Then the thralls position themselves according to their roles. Bodyguards near the entrance, domestic servants by the lord's daily items, specialized crafters with their tools. They take calming herbs, but not enough to fully unconscious. They need to be awake to serve if their lord rises as Draugr. Then the chamber is sealed. The woman describes listening to soil being piled above, using the sound to gauge when to take their final preparations. Historical accounts from Ibn Fadlan and other foreign observers confirm these practices with sickening detail. The Roos funeral he witnessed included a slave girl who spent days preparing for death, drinking and singing while others prepared her grave. The sexual violence preceding her strangulation gets attention, but equally disturbing is how the community treated her death as celebration, her transformation from person to grave good as social elevation rather than murder. The demonstration includes showing specialized grave goods for living burial, air tubes that might extend breathing by minutes, water vessels with careful rations, and most disturbingly, tools for self-termination if the burial goes wrong. One thrall explains how to position yourself to suffocate quickly if panic sets in. Another demonstrates using a small knife to open arteries efficiently in darkness. They're teaching death skills with the same matter-of-fact attitude as fishing or farming techniques. You notice that the free Vikings treating these thralls with unexpected respect, not as equals but as specialists possessing valuable knowledge. The thralls' expertise in death preparation makes them liminal figures, simultaneously worthless property and sacred sacrifices. Some wear amulets indicating which afterlife realm they're contracted to. Others bear runic tattoos mapping paths through the underworld. They're not just dying, but pioneering, exploring death's geography in advance of their masters. The economic structures supporting living burial were complex. Thralls could earn freedom through various means, but many chose burial instead. It guaranteed food and shelter until death, possible honor in the afterlife, an escape from the grinding poverty of freed slaves without resources. Some families sold children into burial contracts, receiving payment up front for future death. The commodification of human sacrifice created markets where death became negotiable currency. Modern archaeological techniques reveal details that make these burials even more horrific. Isotope analysis shows some buried thralls lived well, better diet than many free farmers, suggesting their value as future sacrifices earned present comfort. Others show stress markers indicating years of anxiety about impending burial. Tooth wear patterns suggest some ground their teeth constantly. Jaw clenched against future screams. The physical evidence of psychological torture preceding intentional burial adds layers to the horror. The demonstration concludes with the thralls showing their burial positions, lying in precise arrangements they've rehearsed hundreds of times. They chat casually while demonstrating how they'll spend eternity, adjusting poses for comfort during decomposition, ensuring their tools remain accessible if their lord needs them as Draugr. The banality of evil has never been clearer. Murder systematized into social institution. Victims transformed into willing participants through cultural conditioning and economic coercion. As this final horror sinks in, you realize why the Vikings saved it for last. All the other terrors, Draugr, berserkers, cosmic serpents, were external threats. But this is humans choosing monstrosity, creating horror through social systems rather than supernatural forces. The thralls smile as they practice dying, and their smiles are more terrifying than any monster's snarl, because they reveal how ordinary people can be convinced that their own murders are honorable, even desirable. The demonstration of living burial practices concludes, and the longhouse falls into an exhausted silence. Even these hardened Vikings seem drained by the parade of terrors they've shared with you tonight. The fire burns lower now, casting longer shadows that dance with less menace and more like tired performers at the end of a very long show. Outside, the normal sounds of night return, wind through trees, distant wolves, regular ones, thankfully, the creak of settling wood. After hours of supernatural horror, ordinary darkness feels almost welcoming. The Jarl dismisses the thralls, who return to their corner with the same casual efficiency they'd use after demonstrating any other skill. Warriors begin settling onto benches and floor rushes, pulling cloaks around themselves for warmth and comfort. Someone produces a skin of mead, not the cursed variety from earlier, but simple honey wine, and passes it around. The taste is sweet and grounding after all the metallic terror tang that's coated your mouth throughout this nightmare tour. You find yourself a spot near the dying fire, close enough for warmth, but far enough from the door in case any of tonight's visitors decide on an encore. The Vikings around you are already drifting towards sleep, apparently able to rest despite everything you've witnessed. Perhaps when cosmic horror is part of your daily reality, you develop different thresholds for what keeps you awake. Or maybe they're just exhausted from living in a world where the boundaries between myth and reality barely exist. The smoke from the fire rises lazily now, no longer forming threatening shapes or revealing distant visions. It's just smoke, carrying the scent of burning pine and birch into the night air. You watch it spiral up through the smoke hole where ravens delivered intelligence and Valkyries descended. Now it shows only stars, ordinary stars in their proper constellations, moving at their correct celestial pace. The mundane world has reasserted itself, at least for tonight. Your breathing finally slows to match the rhythm of sleeping Vikings around you. Their snores create an oddly comforting human symphony after all those supernatural sounds. No harmony of the spheres or death songs, just people processing their day through unconscious noise. Someone mutters in their sleep, probably reliving the evening's terrors. But even their nightmare sounds are reassuringly mortal. No possession, no prophecy, just the ordinary fears that visit ordinary dreams. The fire settles with small pops and hisses, each sound making you flinch less as your body remembers how to distinguish normal from supernatural. Those glowing embers are just superheated carbon, not cursed runes or divine messages. The shadows they cast move only with the fire's flickering, not with independent malevolence. You're returning to a world where physics works properly, where cause precedes effect, where the dead stay buried and wolves remain merely animals. As sleep approaches, you reflect on how Vikings lived with such fluid boundaries between natural and supernatural. Every shadow might hide a Draugr. Every storm might be sea descent. Every death might lead to Valhalla or Hell's grey halls. They created elaborate social and legal structures to manage these possibilities, treating cosmic horror as another environmental hazard, requiring practical solutions. It's simultaneously insane and oddly admirable, facing existential terror with the same methodical approach they used for farming and trade. Your eyelids grow heavy as the longhouse's warmth seeps into your bones. The furs beneath you feel soft and reassuring, purely physical comfort after hours of metaphysical threat around you. Vikings sleep peacefully despite knowing that tomorrow might bring new horrors, or old ones returning for another visit. Their acceptance of terror as life's background radiation is perhaps the most unsettling thing you've witnessed tonight, but also strangely comforting. If they can sleep after all this, so can you. The last thing you see before sleep takes you is the fire's final ember glowing like a tiny star in the darkness. It pulses gently, regularly, like a heartbeat slowing toward rest. No supernatural significance, no hidden meaning, just oxidation releasing photons in predictable patterns. The ordinary world wraps around you like a blanket, soft and familiar after your journey through Viking nightmares. Your breathing matches the sleeping warriors around you as you drift into dreams that, whatever they bring, will be yours alone. No Valkyries to judge them, no ravens to report them, no cosmic significance beyond your own sleeping mind, processing the impossible things you've witnessed. Sleep comes as gently as snow, the normal kind that falls downward, obeys gravity, and doesn't whisper prophecies. In this moment between waking horror and dreaming peace, you're safe in the quiet darkness where even Vikings find rest. The terrors will still exist tomorrow, waiting in their various supernatural dimensions. But for now, there's only warmth, only quiet breathing, only the ancient human comfort of sleeping surrounded by others who've survived another day at the edge of cosmic horror. Sweet dreams. and may your sleep be wonderfully, blissfully ordinary.